Isn't there any reason to go?
Well...
Don't you want to show everyone what you've been up to?
Not under these circumstances.
They might have changed. You have.
Look, do you even remember these people?
It's a great honor to be presenting this film in its Costa Rica premiere. And it proves a number of things. One is that the people who come here and join Sat Yoga are already Sat Yogis before they come here. And they already know everything. And they recognize that we are just beginning to catch on to what they already know. So they humor us. And it's very, I was very moved. I previewed the film today, and I learned a lot from it. So I'm very humbled by it. I could barely keep up with what it was teaching. So I want to share with you some of what I learned from the film tonight. And the only reason I want to do that, because I don't really want to spoil the film for you, but I think it deserves a conceptual context as its framework, only because it's so advanced that I think you wouldn't catch a lot of the subtleties. I apologize if that's underestimating you, but I'm just explaining to you how I felt about it. So I'm sharing the inferiority complex it left me with. However, I'm working on it. So. The film is controversial on many levels. It is a consummate and sophisticated demolition of naive realism, for starters. And it threatens what I think was originally a covenant that filmmakers had with viewers that is completely broken in this film, which could be experienced as a betrayal, or it could be experienced as a portal into a multiverse of the fractal dimensionality of the real. And I'm going to take it that way. I read an essay by Slavoj Žižek, who is a film critic, in drag of being a philosopher. But he was talking about how Hitchcock's early films were panned because what was shown on the screen turned out not to be factual, but to be the delusion of one of the characters in the diegetic scenario. And that was the equivalent in literature of the narrator who is unreliable, right? The covenant is that what you see is what you get. If something is shown to you on the screen, it's a fact. This is actually happening. All right? There may be psychological relations to it, reactions to it, flashbacks from it, scenarios that are somehow portrayed via the vocabulary of montage or shimmering of light or various other ways in which film can express to you that we are now entering another plane, whether it's imperience or Sumerians or interdimensionality or whatever it is. Inception is entering the dream field, and dreams within dreams within dreams. Okay, so we're dealing with a multiverse, but supposedly you can depend on, okay, I'm grounded. This is the reality I know as the phenomenal plane, right? But more and more, I think films are breaking through that covenant. You can no longer know what is the nature of the reality that you are being shown and you're entering into. What is the ontological ground of this scenario? And the reason why I think that's important is that in this postmodern context of what we call a world here, I think this is the everyday experience of everyone. Like, where am I? Is this a world? Is this a dream? Is this a nightmare? And it's not true that the psychological response to reality takes place within some factual context. No. In fact, there is no such thing as fact except as a psychological premise that can always be refuted by further experience. As Robert Anton Wilson said, universe is non-simultaneously apprehended. Well, any reality or any scenario is non-simultaneously apprehended, and therefore you can eventually apprehend that what you thought was real was a delusion. And your ontological safety net has been ripped apart. There isn't one. Okay? This is an important recognition, and everyone tends to want to have an ontological safety net where they can say, okay, I'm going to come off this drug. It's only a few more hours and it wears off and I'll know I'm okay again, right? That kind of thing. But what if it doesn't, right? This drug we call reality doesn't wear off that way. And it reveals itself as an unfolding of a multidimensionality that when you pay attention to it, reveals deeper and deeper levels of this fractal that we call the real. And I want to fully consider the real as a fractal. And that's something I think that in Sat Yoga we haven't fully encountered with all of its implications. So the first thing I want to recognize about this film is I would call it a cognidance of the psychic density of a black hole. I would even subtitle this film "The Black Rose." Last night we celebrated the White Rose. I felt like that's what I was entering into, and it caused me to recognize that the teachings of Sat Yoga need to be extended somewhat to account for this film. But I would say it's a hyper-symbolic revelation of the unreal that is always there within the real and that actually constitutes the real. Which is why this paradox of the fact that we are in non-duality and yet its infinite complexity can never be resolved with any given understanding of what is true. Okay, so what we have in the film is the subjective pole of reality masquerading as the objective pole, right? If we go back to the last retreat on the Tao of Love, you remember we start out with Wuji, and then we go to the spanda, the moving of the quantum wave into the Tai Chi, and then that settles out into our famous Yang and Yin. Okay, this I would call the rose. This is the unfoldment of the infinite potentiality out of the non-dual potentiality. Now it's manifesting, but the way it's going to ultimately manifest isn't determined. The collapse of the quantum wave, we could say, happens here. But even here, within, let's say, we call this the objective pole of reality, and this the subjective pole. Within the subjective, you have the objective, and within the objective, you have the subjective. So the two are never really separable. But beyond that, I think we are now living in a culture in which the objective pole of reality is used as a defense against the subjective pole. That's really what materialism is, right? Materialism wants to say consciousness is just an epiphenomenon of the neurology, neurochemistry, neurophysiology. And once you understand that, you can understand everything. Don't worry, we can deal with your anxiety with pills. You know, we can solve it all with chemistry. It's all materialistic. We'll find the right equation, we'll find the right chemicals, and everything will be fine. Well, but that's a defense against the fact that consciousness cannot be controlled or tamed or limited to any construct in which it appears within the world, since it is consciousness that creates our world. Right? So in that understanding then, the subjective pole of reality totally overwhelms the objective pole and makes a mockery of objectivity. And I think this is what those who are scientists and those who are firmly grounded in a reality which can be controlled and mastered by the human intellect, which can solve all the ecological problems, etc., is completely terrorized now when they recognize that it's their efforts of control that are actually causing the problems, whether it's global warming or whatever else. It's a Frankenstein. Our own consciousness within that materialistic mode has now become the monster that's attacking us. The objective now in the form of the subjective response of the collective consciousness. So what I would propose is that in this film, what we are experiencing here, because of the transmogrification of the values of objective and subjective, is that we don't get a scene as we usually get in most films, but we get an unseen of the unseen. Which is probably obscene as well. But what I think is important is that in every scene within this film, what is important is what is unspoken and unspeakable in the dialogue or the monologue, and what is invisible and what is unvisualizable. But that's what you're being shown. You see, and how does a filmmaker show what cannot be seen, what cannot be made visible as an object? Because if you're trying to show subjective reality, but all you have is objective film grammar, you cannot show a delusion qua delusion. You have to show it as the objective reality as which it appears to one who is delusional. Right? Okay. So, I'm trying to ask my teacher if I'm on the right track here. And I think that the film succeeds in doing that, which is extraordinary in itself. But what it also teaches, I think, because of the fact that once you understand that what you're seeing here is subjective consciousness, not an objective situation, then you have to recognize that the film is not composed of its actors. It's composed of a combination of actors and actants. Okay? And the actants in this film are far more important than the actors. And you can miss it because some of the actants appear for literally a split second. So I would say the protagonist of this film is light. It's not the people in the film. But light appears in two ways. It appears as a flood of light, and it appears as a flash of light. And twice it appears in this film as almost an instantaneous flash that you may not even recognize, that shifts you from one subjective reality into another. Correct? And if you...
Yeah! Wow.
Yeah. But if you don't understand that the light is what is guiding you into a shift of ontological reality, you won't then appreciate how the light at the end comes in with the denouement as the flood of light now, a flash flood perhaps, but the freedom from the prison that consciousness has become, in a quite literally barred sense, in the last scene of the film, to open the door to a multi-dimensional freedom that would not have been possible without having fallen into the delusion and the prison of the paranoia of the ego. Okay? Right? So, on the obvious level, what we're dealing with is simply an alcoholic haze. The party is all about beer and cigarettes and flirting and dissing each other, talking shit about each other, quote unquote, as is one of the important signifiers of the film. But what we're dealing with is the actant of light, the actant of the unspeakable, the invisible, and I think that one of the more important signifiers of the film is the breaking of glass, which is extremely important for us because last night the breaking of glass was the climax of our party. No accident here. There's a synchronicity here. So in the film, it's the breaking of beer bottles and the breaking of other objects, whether in a temper tantrum or in something else. But the breaking of glass in a Jewish marriage is, of course, the beginning of the breaking of the hymen, the breaking of the separation, the intercourse of one to another, a new reality that is created by a couple coming together. It's always the breaking through into a new real. Right? So the glass can operate either as a mirror, which shows you back at yourself the face that you are showing to a world, or it's a diaphanon that allows you to see through it, but not reach what is beyond it. So the glass has to break. In the same way that last night the Nisargadatta glass had to break, because we have to go beyond Nisargadatta if we're going to get to the ultimate real. And he can be an obstacle, or he can be a passageway. But you have to be willing to break the glass in order to become the real and not just look at it. Okay. 4 things I think are ethical proposals made by this film. 1, we choose our state of consciousness. You can choose sobriety, you can choose to be drunk on beer, you could choose to have some other drug, you could choose meditation, you could choose whatever state of consciousness you want to be in, and we are always making that choice. And the choice of your state of consciousness will choose what it is then possible to be aware of, and what will then be the parameters of your reality and the windows of opportunity that will be open to you to break through into another dimension. So once that has been made within any given state of consciousness, you can then choose your degree of sensitivity and cognizance, right? You can be in an alcoholic haze and still either have a lot of clarity within let's say, what would I say about it? It's an angle, it's a shift of perspective that's created, but the depth of that shift is still something that is within your capacity of free choice. Third, you choose the identity fragment with which you want to confront any given situation. And we all have a number of possible fragments that we could choose. From childhood, superego figures, paranoid monsters, whatever we want to choose. And often we appear as several of those fragments, as a multiplicity rather than a unity. That's when you hear voices and you're talking to yourself, and etc. Okay, and then the 4th is the level in which you do not choose, but in which you are chosen. So no matter in what situation you are, and it could be the darkest hell realm, it could be the worst anxiety, it could be a panic attack, it could be depression, suicidal thoughts, whatever it is, there is always the possibility of grace entering in. The light can enter in no matter how much of darkness there is, but to be chosen to experience a way out of the prison also, in a way, is the reciprocal of your own choice. You make the choice, but you make it as that which you have not yet owned as part of your identity, which comes to you as God, as the light, as the angel of death, as whatever it is. That is your form of imaginary. Okay, then the 3rd thing we get into, or I don't know, 3rd thing, we're probably at the 20th thing. The next thing that we get into is the question of names. And I think the most important name here is the name of the woman who is the object of desire, around which the plot, to the extent that there is a plot, appears, and her name is Malin. And Malin, in its Swedish version of Magdalena, right? Mary Magdalene. But, of course, in French, Malin, mal, fleur du mal, is evil, and Malin can also be clever. In Sanskrit, Malin happens to mean one who is crowned or garlanded. Okay, so there's a number of echoes of signifiers in different linguistic contexts that I'm sure Bomo is considering in giving this name. And that are all relevant to the meaning of this woman who carries so much magnetic power of desire that she can split the consciousness of a being into its fragments, in the same way that a prism can turn a beam of white light into a rainbow. So we see all of that appearing, and we wonder, what is making it appear? And here's where I think we need to take this and blow it up into a fractal form. So if you will allow me permission to recontextualize the yin-yang symbol. Let's say this is where our ordinary reality begins, but within it we know that there is a second circle and a third circle, and probably more. So let's say this is our yin-yang, and it will continue down here, and here we have the obverse. So this is a yin-yang, but within it there is another yin-yang with its own dynamics, and within that another one, etc. And I'm not saying this is the end, and we can extend actually beyond the initial one. So let's say this is representing phenomenal reality in ordinary consciousness, ego consciousness. Here's your yin-yang. This is going to be real one. Real one is the world as you see it as an objective reality, right? And then your subjective reality is going to modify that in some way at its own level. But within that, I may have to draw a few more within this to really get the full picture. Let's say that this will be real 2 beyond it. Real 2, and beyond that, real 3, that many people may not be aware of. We'll say this is when you're in a state of saintly divine love, and this is when you have actually experienced the absolute. But within real 1, at the infrapsychic level, you're going to get real 0, which we'll just call that sleep. And then we can get real -1, which would be the level of dream. And then within that, real -2, which would be the level of delusion. If the circles continue even within that, we'd get real -3. And real -3, I'm going to call the dark one, which is the polar opposite of real +3, which is the supreme luminous one, right? This would be what would be represented archetypally as Satan or the demonic. So all of these levels are present within the different dimensions of our consciousness. And when you are thinking you experience some reality here, you experience it as being modified both by the sleep, which is the censor, not wanting to know certain things, cutting out certain information, making certain things passa por alto, etc. It's also being modified by dream imagery that represents archetypal forces and the messages of the Atman, but also by delusions of real -2, which come from the very negative forces of fear and lack and conflict and antagonism and hatred. And then the real -3, the total black hole of darkness of the psyche at its most ultimately contracted state. I think in this film all of these are visible, the whole gamut of consciousness, which is why I think it's one of the few complete films ever made of the entire spectrum of the map of consciousness. So, with that as a preliminary, there's a lot further we could go with it, but I think I don't want to take too much time right now. As you'll see, I've just scratched the surface of the content of this film, but I think that what we're in for is a very delightful explication of the psychic nature of experience. So thank you very much. Namaste. Afterward, we'll hear the real story from the filmmaker, and I'll look forward to that too.